How can a regime terrorize millions of its subjects and yet remain into power for decades? This is one of the questions that Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn asks in his magnus opus, the Gulag Archipelago. Solzhenitsyn himself went through the horrors of the system. He was arrested in made-up charges, interrogated under conditions that we'd consider conditions of torture, and then he spent many years in different labor camps. But also he collected many stories, and a combination of storytelling and of historiography and of introspections and recollections, he tries to explain the evil in Soviet Union. So, in the version where the 3 volumes are actually in one, in part 4, we will read from the section 3, Our Muzzled Freedoms, where Solzhenitsyn gives the 10 reasons that he thinks explain why the system managed to have such a successful control over its populations. So let's jump in it. Factor number 1. The first reason why the horror in Soviet Union was so successful. Constant fear. Constant fear. So what does this mean? Every authoritarian regime oppresses its opponents. There's nothing special there. The special thing in Soviet Union was that no one was safe. You didn't have to actually be an opponent of the regime to find your life ruined. Actually, in the period of the Great Terror in the 30s, in the late 30s, and with all the purges, many loyal communists and the majority of the leadership of the party found themselves in the torture chamber or executed or in the Gulag, in the labor camp. So as Solzhenitsyn puts it, any adult inhabitant of this country, from a collective farmer up to a member of the Politburo, always knew that it would take only one careless word or gesture and he would fly off irrevocably into the abyss. End of quote. So you didn't have to go out and protest or be a dissident. One mistake, or not even a mistake, someone falsely implicating you under torture, or a secret police officer who had a quota of how many people he would have to arrest, and he would arrest you. This would mean the end of your life as you knew it. And there were hundreds of thousands of such cases. Today, this is not even controversial. Today, this is 100% given as historical knowledge that the vast majority of people who went through the terror in the 30s, but even before and after that, actually Solzhenitsyn was arrested towards the end of the Second World War, they did nothing wrong, nothing that had anything to do with any dissident activity. The result of this is that there's a permanent net of fear and of terror. You cannot relax anywhere. Anyone could point the finger at you, and anything that you could say, a joke or an offhand remark, can ruin your life. And again, as Solzhenitsyn puts at the end, peace of mind is something our citizens have never known. And what is the effect of this? The effect of this is that in this climate of fear, any criticism to the regime becomes unthinkable, because you already know that millions of people are suffering without even criticizing the regime. So imagine what would happen if you criticize the regime. So very, very successful control mechanism. There's actually an egalitarianism of terror. From the Politburo to the last worker, each and every citizen is a candidate to enter the train going to the Gulag. The second characteristic that explains the amount of control the regime had on people, what he calls servitude. This actually means that your life is under the control of people and you cannot get away from them. So, for example, your party cell. You cannot say, okay, I've had enough, I don't like my new party cell boss, I'm leaving. Or at your job, you cannot say, I've had enough, I don't like my line manager, goodbye, see you. No. your life is under the direct hierarchical control of people above you. And if you fell into disfavor, there's nothing you can do to change this. You cannot have a clean start. You cannot have a new start. And imagine how bad this would be. Imagine a job that you don't like, or imagine you don't like your landlord, and not only you're stuck there forever, but you're under scrutiny and you're already in disfavor, so it will take the slightest mistake for you to be persecuted, or best case, find yourself without a job, and then probably you will fall to the category of a beggar, or I don't remember how they call them, which also probably means you go to the Gulag. The third characteristic of the tyranny was secrecy and mistrust. Why secrecy? Secrecy because once someone close to you was considered an enemy of the people, it was something like a contagious disease. Now you carry the virus. Now you are contagious because they might implicate you. And also we're talking about a country where officially collective responsibility was a thing. Stalin gave direct orders having to do with persecuting family members of the people he considered political opponents. So there's the example of a woman whose husband was arrested, but she would have to hide it. And she told her family actually that my husband ran away with another woman. Because again, if you had the stamp of the enemy of the people, the enemy of the regime, now you become dangerous for the people around you. Now you're a danger to the people you love. And this constant mistrust means that you cannot have meaningful relationships with other people. And without meaningful relationships, you cannot have things like political organization or things like building up a resistant movement. So secrecy and mistrust, also very successful control mechanism. Characteristic number 4 in Soviet Union, universal ignorance. What does this mean? Well, of course, whatever you read in the newspapers is party narrative, but you cannot even challenge it when talking with your family, with your friends. Again, remember, one word listened by someone, overheard by someone, might be the end of your life as you know it. So you can never interrogate the truth. Even thinking like, is this true, is this false? It's dangerous, literally dangerous even to think, because you cannot share these thoughts with anyone. Think about it. You spot, for example, a mistake in the line of production. Even if you share it to your wife, if something happens to you, means that your wife is now a co-conspirator. Or you put ideas in her head, she might want to challenge the party boss, she's in trouble. So it's better to stay ignorant. Literally ignorant is bliss within the context of a horrible dictatorship. Of course, you cannot live a life, not even a successful, a meaningful life in ignorance, so this regime is contradictory to what your life requires. Characteristic number 5, squealing. That means informing. So we're talking about a regime with hundreds of thousands of people working officially as secret police, and each of these people having more people who were unofficial informants. So we're talking about millions of people who in some way or the other, their job was to inform on other people. And in the Black Book of Communism, we read that at some point, the NKVD, the secret police, to put it simply, it's not super accurate, but let's put it this way, had at some point 365,000 members. 365,000 members. Put into perspective, the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police at that time, has 7,500 people. So magnitudes of more secret police officers in Soviet Union. And of course, these people had to do something to qualify their position. If the guy in the next office has spotted 100 enemies of the people, if you only spot 3 enemies of the people, something is wrong with you. Maybe you are an enemy of the people yourself. So you have to make up enemies of the people. You have to torture people to give false information or false claiming that they're traitors of the people. So this is something very unique in Soviet Union. Again, particularly in the Stalin years. Because in the typical dictatorship, you torture someone, which is horrendous, but you do it to get the truth out of them. Who are your friends in the resistance? In Soviet Union, you torture someone to give you a script that you have given to them. It makes zero sense. You torture someone to implicate themselves in something that they haven't done, and you know, the torturer knows perfectly well that they haven't done this. But Solzhenitsyn points out another interesting element. He says, when you have a regime with all these people being informers or secret police members, now all these millions of people have a stake at this regime not falling, because if the regime falls, their dirty laundry will come into the surface. So most of them probably hate what they do, and it was actually very usual for a secret police to be the victim in the next purge. And yet these people now have a stake in this regime that possibly they also loathe to stay in power, because they rely on each other for their crimes not to be revealed. Point number 6 of the evil that made this tyranny possible. Betrayal as a form of existence. Betrayal as a form of existence. And this is very, very dark. So you had to constantly betray, A, your consciousness, but 2, people who you loved. For example, if your friend was arrested or disappeared, you couldn't try to figure out what happened to them. You couldn't visit them during their interrogation. You couldn't support them in any way. Because what? You're supporting an enemy of the people. You're next. You'll be in the nearby tortured cell. You couldn't even show sympathy to their family. Think about that. Someone leaves behind a woman and a child. You love these people. You cannot show them any support. You have to estrange yourself from them. Imagine what this does to your consciousness, to your self-esteem, to your sense of who you are. So much for brotherly love. Like, we're talking about a regime that makes you the worst type of human being imaginable. So, constant betrayal. Or, Solzhenitsyn gives the example, someone at work might be arrested. This guy was the guy next with whom you shared an office, or with whom you shared the floor in the factory. And not only you cannot support him, you have to give a speech denouncing him. Imagine again, what does this do to your sense of self? It destroys you. And once your sense of self is destroyed, you cannot stand up to the regime. You haven't got the self-esteem to stand up to that regime. You denounced. So who are you now to point any finger? So this is a very, very insidious control mechanism. And remember, you had to denounce them because if you wanted to play the hero, it's not only you who would suffer. Your family would suffer. Even your kids would suffer. We're talking about a regime that at least in the 30s and till Stalin died, but definitely 30s and 40s, collective responsibility is institutionalized. It's not even like a secret practice. So you have to constantly betray what you consider is justice, what you consider is the right thing to do, for with a concern to yourself and to your beloved ones. What a horrible position to be in. And of course, this leads to number 7, the 7th characteristic, corruption. This corrupts your soul, and at some point, you internalize that, yeah, this is who I am. This is the kind of person I am. I'm the person who betrays. I'm the person who does not stand up for justice, who does not stand up for the good. And again, as we said, many people officially became corrupt, officially became informants, or they pointed the finger. Here's the darkest one, the darkest characteristic is the 8th one, the lie as a form of existence. This means that reality becomes your enemy. What you see one thing, but you have to say another thing. As Solzhenitsyn puts it, nothing forces them to speak the truth in reply, but no one allows them to keep silent. They have to talk. And you have to talk what? You have to talk the party language. So you can, again, this is a regime where you cannot just say, I'll stay home, I'll keep out of politics, I'll be good, which is usually what happens with your typical political dictatorship. This is a regime that you have to talk and you have to think based on the script that you are given. So you have to praise the secret police. You have to denounce the people who were your comrades, the people with whom you fought in the trenches, in the revolution, in the Civil War, in the First World War. Imagine what type of people. They did a revolution together, they were in exile together, and then they had to denounce their friends as jackals of imperialism, as disgusting Nazi spies or whatever. And you knew that all this was a lie. So imagine what this puts you in collision course with reality. You see reality and you have to say something else. And it gives the example, for example, of someone who had to give a talk on the Stalinist constitution, the most democratic in the world. He knew that this was a lie, but he had to put himself to give a talk on something he didn't believe in. And then next week he was anyway arrested. So his self-esteem was destroyed, and he didn't save himself. Ingenious in its monstrosity control mechanism. As he said, also Solzhenitsyn put it, there is no man who has typed even one page without lying. There is no man who has spoken into a microphone without lying. And then he gives the darkest example. What do you do with your children? How do you raise your children? Someone who cares about their children raises them so that they develop their main tool of survival, which is their mind, reason, logic. See what reality is and act accordingly. But this is very dangerous. As Solzhenitsyn puts it, you had to instill into them from the start that the truth was murderous. You see something, keep quiet. You measure something as right or wrong, keep quiet. So the only way a child can succeed in life is to recognize truth and reality. But you have to teach them to lie. You have to teach them to evade. You have to teach them to keep quiet. So you raise your child to a subhuman level of existence, not operating by your mind, by your own mind, but operating by the lies of others. What a monstrous, impossible situation you find yourself in. If I raise my child and set them up for a successful life, they're gonna end up with their life destroyed. The only way for them to survive is to teach them not to see reality, but you cannot survive if you don't see reality. What an impossible situation. Quite often these days we hear people saying, well, we live in a world which has gone mad, there's gonna be climate catastrophe, we shouldn't bring children in the world. This is a situation, though, where seriously, literally, you cannot bring children in the world because you wouldn't be able to teach them how to live. There's no way they can live. There's no way a rational human being can even survive in such a regime. So as Solzhenitsyn puts it, the choice was really such that you would rather not have any children. So the ninth characteristic then is cruelty. Again, you have to not show any pity. You have to clap on these people's demise, on the demise of millions of people. There were protests and asking for heavier punishments for the enemies of the people. Mercy was ridiculed, pity was ridiculed, so again, no sympathy even to people who were very dear to you. And all this leads to the 10th factor that explains the success of the Soviet regime in surviving all these years by exploiting and terrorizing millions of people, which is what Solzhenitsyn calls slave psychology. All these things destroy, again, who you are. They destroy you as a human being, your sense of right and wrong, your sense of justice, yourself, your sense of self. And without self-esteem, you cannot rise up for what you believe is right. You cannot rise up against this regime. So, overall, I don't think Solzhenitsyn is one of the deepest critics of communism. I think, for example, Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged, where she says the 20th century motor company factory story, she does a better job than Solzhenitsyn in getting in the depth of what is wrong with communism. But this condensed 10 points by Solzhenitsyn on the particularly evil characteristics of Soviet Union that managed to perpetuate its reign of terror, found them very, very useful. I hope you found value in this video as well. Talk to you soon.